The evening had that kind of calm that doesn't announce itself. It simply settles in. The rain outside was soft, almost apologetic, brushing against the kitchen window like a secret trying not to be heard. The soup on the stove hummed gently, a quiet reminder that life, at least for now, was ordinary. She stood there, wooden spoon in hand, half listening to the rhythm of her own breathing. There was comfort in routine, the way the steam curled upward, the faint warmth on her face, the stillness that made the whole room feel like it was holding its breath. Then the phone rang. It wasn't loud, not urgent, just a small sound that cut through the hum of everyday life. A single note that carried everything that would come after. She almost didn't answer. Maybe she knew, somewhere deep inside, that some calls change more than a day. They change the way you see everything that ever felt safe. But habit is stronger than intuition, so she wiped her hands on a towel and picked it up. Her sister's voice trembled through the line, hesitant, uneven. The kind of tone people use when they've been told something they wish they hadn't heard. There was a pause before the words came, the kind that stretches just long enough to make the heart tighten. I just thought you should know. They're planning something, but they don't want your child there. The words landed softly, but they didn't stop echoing. For a second, she didn't move. She didn't speak. The world didn't break apart in noise or tears, it just paused. The spoon slipped from her hand, hitting the counter with a dull, wet sound. The soup began to bubble over, but she couldn't smell it anymore. All she could hear was the rain, and her sister's uneven breathing on the other end of the line. Her first thought wasn't anger. It was confusion, that strange, quiet disbelief that arrives before grief. Surely there had been some misunderstanding. Families don't do that, not to their own. They don't erase a child quietly from gatherings, from photographs, from belonging. They don't pretend love has boundaries, or that inclusion is something to be earned. But as her sister's voice wavered again, I just thought you should know before you saw it yourself. The truth began to settle. Not fast, not violent, just slow, certain, and unrelenting, like the way water seeps through cracks no one knew existed. She thanked her sister softly, or maybe she didn't. She couldn't remember. The call ended, and she was left staring at the phone, still hearing the faint echo of the words that had just redrawn the borders of her world. The rain grew louder. The soup hissed where it had spilled. The clock on the wall ticked on, indifferent. She walked to the window and stood there, watching the streetlights blur through the rain. There were cars moving somewhere far away, lives continuing as if the universe hadn't just shifted. And that's when it hit her, the ache beneath the disbelief. It wasn't just what they had said, it was who had said it. Her family, the ones who had taught her that blood was thicker than anything, that love was what made people unbreakable. She thought of her child, small, bright, unfiltered joy wrapped in innocence. And she felt something hollow open inside her. How do you explain to a child that love sometimes comes with conditions? That some doors close not with anger, but with quiet decisions made in rooms you'll never enter? She turned off the stove, the soup now forgotten, the air heavy with the scent of something burnt. The house felt larger than it had a moment ago, emptier too. Every object around her seemed to belong to a different life, one that no longer fit. There were no tears yet. Just stillness, the kind that comes when your heart hasn't caught up to what your mind already knows. She sat at the kitchen table and placed her phone in front of her, as if it might speak again, explain itself, undo the words it had carried. But the screen stayed black, silent, cold. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had started folding in on itself, shrinking around the sound of that one sentence. They don't want your child there, some betrayals shout. Others whisper. This one barely breathed, and somehow that made it worse. When she finally moved, it was only to close the window. The rain had turned heavier, splashing against the glass, spilling down like something trying to get in. She could smell the dampness in the air. That clean, lonely scent that follows when the sky can't hold itself anymore. Her hands trembled, though not from cold. There's a moment, just before grief finds its name, when the body knows before the heart does, when the air feels heavier and everything you once trusted feels distant, unreachable. She didn't call anyone back. She didn't tell her child. She just let the silence fill the room until it became something tangible, something she could almost touch. Later, when she would look back, she'd remember this night not as the one that broke her, but the one that began to open her eyes. Because betrayal, when it comes from love, doesn't always destroy. Sometimes, it reveals what was never whole to begin with. As she turned off the last light and stood in the doorway, she caught her reflection in the darkened window. Still, quiet, and changed. Somewhere deep inside, a truth began to whisper. Love can close its doors quietly and still hurt louder than any scream. There are houses that raise you, and there are houses that teach you how to disappear. The one I grew up in did both. It wasn't unkind, just quiet. The kind of quiet that looked like order to everyone else. Polished furniture, framed smiles, voices that never rose above polite. A house where the sound of a door closing softly meant peace had been restored, and where silence was mistaken for love. I remember mornings filled with the smell of starch and coffee. My mother standing by the window, her back straight, her voice calm. She used to hum sometimes, not songs of joy, but of habit. Something to fill the air between one expectation and the next. My father's footsteps echoed predictably through the hallway, steady and measured, as if emotion had its own schedule. We didn't say, "I love you" out loud. We said it through doing what was expected, through clean rooms and perfect grades, through never being the reason someone sighed at the dinner table. In our family, love was obedience, and peace was silence. As a child, I learned early how to fold myself into the spaces that caused the least noise. When arguments whispered through the walls, I'd sit on my bed and trace the lines on my hands, reminding myself to stay still. Stillness was safety. Quietness was acceptance. It didn't take long for those things to become my nature. There's a photograph somewhere. I must have been 8 or 9, standing between my parents, my hands clasped politely in front of me. I remember the day so clearly. My mother adjusted my collar twice before the camera clicked. My father smiled just enough to look pleased. When the photo came back, we looked perfect, but I remember how my stomach hurt from holding my breath. That was the thing about our home. It looked whole from the outside. And for years, I thought that was enough, to look like love. I grew up mastering smallness. Small laughter that didn't carry down the hall. Small questions that didn't make anyone uncomfortable. Small dreams that didn't reach beyond what my parents had planned. And with every smallness I practiced, I became invisible. Not all at once, but gently, like a shadow fading at dusk. When I left that house as an adult, I told myself I was free. But freedom is strange when you've spent your life earning permission to exist. Even after I moved away, I still spoke softly, smiled when it hurt, apologized for taking up space. I didn't know how to stop being the quiet one, and then I became a mother. When my child was born, it was as if color returned to the world. There was laughter that didn't ask to be small, joy that didn't know how to whisper. This tiny, radiant soul, fearless, curious, loud in the most beautiful way. They'd run barefoot through puddles, sing songs to themselves while drawing, fill every corner of the house with something alive. At first, I worried. I'd tell them, "Shh, not so loud," the same way my mother once told me. And they'd look up at me with those wide, questioning eyes, full of light I didn't know how to hold. It struck me then. I was passing down the same quiet that once caged me. So I tried to stop. I tried to unlearn the hush that lived in my bones. But the world has a way of testing what you're trying to heal. My family began to visit again. Birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners that smelled like nostalgia and restraint. They'd sit on the same old furniture, speak in the same soft tones. And when my child laughed, really laughed, I'd see my mother's polite smile stiffen just a little. "It's good they're so spirited," she'd say, and my father would nod. But his eyes would wander, searching for something quieter, something that looked more familiar. Those moments cut deeper than they should have, because for all my efforts to build a new kind of love, Part of me still wanted their approval, still wanted to be the daughter who made things easy, still wanted to fit in that picture-perfect frame of belonging. But my child, they didn't know how to shrink. And maybe that was the first gift they ever gave me. The realization that love isn't meant to be quiet. Sometimes, at night, after putting them to bed, I'd sit in the living room and watch the moonlight stretch across the floor. The house was peaceful, but not the kind of peace I grew up with. This was living peace, messy, loud, unpredictable. It had toys scattered across the couch, half-finished drawings taped to the fridge, laughter echoing faintly down the hall, and in that chaos, I found something sacred. Still, when my parents called, I softened my voice. When we visited their home, I told my child to behave. Not because they needed to, but because I did. Because I still believed that keeping the peace meant keeping love. It took years to see the truth. I hadn't just been taught to stay small. I'd been taught that my worth depended on it. And now, watching my child's unfiltered joy, I realized I was the bridge between the silence I came from and the freedom they were born into. One afternoon, I found my child playing in the backyard, twirling under a drizzle of rain. The same kind of rain that used to hush me into stillness as a girl. But instead of telling them to come inside, I stood by the window and watched, smiling through the ache of recognition. They looked up, soaked and radiant, and shouted, "Come dance, Mama!" For the first time, I did. We danced under the rain, laughter spilling into the sky, the sound of generations breaking and beginning all at once. Later that night, as I tucked them in, they whispered, "You're not like Grandma. You laugh more." It made me pause, not out of hurt, but out of gratitude. Because in that simple observation, they had named everything I had been trying to become. That night, I realized something quiet and powerful. I wasn't raising my child to fit into the family I came from. I was raising them to outgrow it. And maybe that's what love really is. Not repeating what you were taught, but choosing to build something gentler in its place. As I lay in bed, the old memories drifted in. My mother's soft hum, my father's nods, the weight of silence that once felt like safety. But now, instead of bitterness, there was understanding. They had done what they knew, and I was doing what I must, teaching my child that love doesn't ask you to shrink. It asks you to stay. The house I grew up in taught me how to be small, but the one I've built since then, it's teaching me, every day, how to be whole. There's a particular kind of tension that only happens in families, the kind that hides beneath smiles and polite laughter. You feel it in the pauses, between words, in the glance exchanged across the dinner table, in the way someone clears their throat before changing the subject. It's not anger, it's preservation. Everyone trying to keep the peace by pretending the silence doesn't hurt. The first time I brought my child to my parents' house, I wanted it to go well. I wanted the moment to be beautiful. 3 generations gathered around the same table. I told my child stories on the drive there. How Grandma used to bake perfect round cookies. How Grandpa once fixed my broken bicycle with a butter knife and faith. They were stories soaked in nostalgia, filtered through years of distance and longing. But when we arrived, the air was different. The house was still the same. The smell of furniture polish, the framed photos, the heavy curtains keeping the sunlight out. Only now, it all felt smaller, as if the rooms had grown used to quiet and didn't quite know what to do with laughter anymore. My child ran down the hallway, their voice ringing against the walls like bells. I saw my mother flinch, just slightly, before she smiled. "Sweetheart, we use our inside voice here," she said gently. Her tone was kind, but I knew that rhythm, it was the same one she used on me years ago, the melody of correction wrapped in love. My father, ever the observer, sat at his usual spot, reading glasses perched low. He gave my child a soft pat on the head and said, "Good energy, that one." but I could tell. It was an observation, not approval. The meal began the way it always did. Quiet, careful, orderly. My mother served food in perfect portions, smoothing each spoonful like it was a ceremony. My child chattered between bites, telling stories about school, their friends, their drawings. Every few minutes, I caught my parents exchanging small, worried glances, the kind that said, "She's raising them too freely." And there I was, caught between two worlds. Part of me felt proud of my child's brightness, their open heart. But another part of me, the old one, felt the pull of shame. That familiar whisper, "Tone it down. Don't make a scene." I smiled. Tightly, lowered my child's voice with a gentle hand on their shoulder, and said, "Let Grandma finish her story." Even as I said it, I hated how much it sounded like my mother. After dinner, my child wandered toward the piano in the corner. It hadn't been played in years, not since I was a teenager. I used to play it after school, hoping someone would listen. But my mother would always call from the kitchen, "Not too loud, dear. Your father's resting." So, I learned to press the keys softly, to make music that nobody could hear. Now, watching my child's small hands slam joyfully across those same keys, I felt tears sting my eyes. Each note was wild, imperfect, alive. Everything my childhood wasn't. The sound filled the house like a breath held too long. But then, my mother appeared in the doorway. Her smile was polite, but her voice carried the weight of habit. "Sweetheart, maybe not so loud. Grandpa's watching his show." And just like that, the song stopped. The air folded back into quiet obedience. My child looked at me, confusion flickering in their eyes, waiting to see what I would do. In that moment, I felt like both the child and the mother, both the one who had been silenced and the one now holding the power to silence. My heart split between generations, wanting to protect both. I walked over, knelt beside my child, and whispered, "It's okay. You can play. Music makes the house happy." Then I looked up at my mother and added softly, "Let her finish the song." For a moment, no one moved. My mother's eyes flickered, something between hurt and realization passing through them. But she nodded, slowly, almost reluctantly. And so, my child continued. The piano filled the room again, this time, unashamed. That night, after we left, my mother called me. Her voice was calm, as always. "You're doing a good job with them," she said. I smiled into the phone, surprised by the warmth in her tone. Then came the pause, the kind I'd learned to brace for. But maybe teach them to be a little more gentle. The world isn't always kind to children who take up too much space. There it was, the echo of her own childhood speaking through her. I didn't argue. I just said, "I know," because I understood what she meant. She wasn't criticizing. She was protecting, in the only way she knew. Still, that night, as I tucked my child into bed, I thought about her words. The world may not be kind to loud hearts, but wasn't that all the more reason to keep them loud? My child asked sleepily, "Mom, did Grandma like my song?" I brushed their hair back and said, "She did. She just forgot how to show it." And that felt true, painfully, beautifully true. Weeks passed. Visits continued, and every time we went, I watched two versions of love meet at the table, one that guarded peace through silence, and one that celebrated it through laughter. Both sincere, both flawed, both trying to love the only way they knew how. But something began to shift, slowly, quietly. One evening, while my child played again, I noticed my mother humming along. Her hands trembled slightly on her teacup. but she didn't tell them to stop. She just listened. And for the first time in a long time, the house felt alive. Later, as we were leaving, my mother stood at the doorway, watching my child skip down the steps. She said softly, "She reminds me of you, before you learned to whisper." I looked at her then, really looked, and I saw it. The regret in her eyes, the love she didn't know how to say, the silence she had inherited from someone long before her. And I realized she wasn't the villain in my story. She was another quiet child who had once been told the same thing. Be small. Stay still. Don't be too much. That night, I cried. Not from sadness, but from release. Because maybe healing doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like a mother choosing not to shush her child. Sometimes it looks like a grandmother humming along to a song she once silenced. And sometimes it looks like 3 generations learning together that love can be loud. Some apologies never arrive the way we imagine. They don't come wrapped in perfect sentences or teary confessions. Sometimes they come in gestures so small, you almost miss them. Like the way someone sets an extra plate at the table or folds your child's jacket before you leave. That's how my mother apologized. Not through words, but through quiet acts of care she didn't know how to name. After that evening, the one where she let my child finish their song, something in her softened. She began calling more often, asking how school was going, what my child liked to draw these days. Her tone had changed, less formal, more curious, as if she was learning how to be part of our world again, one phone call at a time. Still, the past lingered. There were memories I hadn't touched in years, moments that sat buried under the polite conversations and holiday visits. Like the time she threw away my diary because she said, "Some thoughts aren't worth keeping." Or the day I told her I was scared to go to school and she replied, "You'll be fine. Don't make everything so dramatic." Those words had shaped me, carved into the silence that would later define our relationship. And yet, when I watched her now, her hands shaking slightly as she helped my child pour tea, I couldn't see the same woman I once resented. Age had softened her. But maybe it wasn't just age. Maybe it was seeing love done differently. One afternoon, I visited alone. It was raining, the kind of steady rain that makes everything feel suspended. I found her in the kitchen, standing by the window, watching the garden she used to tend so carefully. The sound of rain on the roof filled the silence between us. Not uncomfortable, just full. Without looking at me, she said, "You've become a good mother." The words landed gently, like a leaf finding its place in the water. I smiled. I had a good example. She chuckled, low and uncertain. "I don't know about that." I leaned against the counter. "You did what you knew, and I'm learning to do a little differently." Her eyes stayed on the window. Sometimes I wish I'd known better. That was it. No dramatic pause, no tears. Just 6 words that carried the weight of a lifetime. I wanted to tell her I forgave her. But somehow, saying it out loud felt too loud, too fragile. So instead, I just reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. And in that quiet kitchen, hand over hand, the apology she couldn't say and the forgiveness I hadn't offered yet found their way to each other. We stood there for a long while, watching the rain blur the world outside. Every drop felt like a memory washing clean, the sharp edges dulling, the wounds softening into something almost gentle. A few weeks later, my mother invited us for dinner, just the 3 of us. When we arrived, the table was already set. But this time, there was something different. The piano had been moved to the living room, facing the open window. I noticed a small vase on top, filled with wildflowers my child had picked from our backyard weeks earlier. She'd kept them, dried and delicate. After dinner, my child sat at the piano again. But before they could ask, my mother smiled and said, "Would you play that song I liked?" Her voice trembled slightly, but it was full of warmth. My child's face lit up, and the melody filled the house once more. The same wild, imperfect tune that had once been too loud for her liking. But this time, my mother closed her eyes and listened. Her lips moved, whispering the rhythm like a prayer. I watched her, realizing that this quiet acceptance was her apology. No grand words, no explanations. Just presence. Just listening. Just love. Finally learning how to take up space. Later that evening, as we were leaving, she called me back. In her hand was an old music box, the one she used to keep on her dresser when I was a child. She pressed it into my palm and said, "You always wanted this." When I opened it, the soft tune played, faint but steady. I remembered how I used to sneak into her room just to listen to it spin. "I thought it was broken," I said. "It was," she smiled faintly. "I had it fixed." Then she added almost to herself, "Some things just need a second chance to sound right again." I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because that one sentence, quiet, almost casual, carried everything she couldn't bring herself to say. "I love you. I'm sorry. I wish I had known how to love you better." That night when I got home, I placed the music box on my child's bedside table. When they asked where it came from, I said, "It's from Grandma. She wanted you to have it." My child wound it up and smiled as the tune played softly into the dark. They fell asleep to it, the way I used to, before silence became my inheritance. And as I watched them, I realized that something sacred had happened. Something so small, it could only be felt, not spoken. The cycle had shifted. The noise of misunderstanding had turned into the music of forgiveness. The love that had been trapped in old patterns had finally found a way to move forward, through sound, through gesture, through the quiet willingness to try again. Because sometimes, the truest apologies aren't made of words. They're made of moments, small, patient, trembling moments where love chooses to listen instead of defend, where silence becomes a bridge instead of a wall, where generations find each other again, not by forgetting the past, but by letting it rest. There are moments in life that don't arrive with sound. They unfold in quiet recognition, in the soft release of something you've carried for too long. For me, it happened on an ordinary morning. Sunlight spilling across the kitchen counter, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. The same room where I once stood frozen by the ring of a phone, now bathed in gentle light. It had been months since that night with my mother. The music box still sat on my child's bedside table, its tiny melody worn from being played too often. And though the distance between us had lessened, a quiet ache still lingered, the kind that comes from years of unsaid words. That morning, I decided to visit again. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. The drive was calm, almost weightless. The trees along the old road were bare, late autumn, when everything prepares to rest. I remember thinking how strange it was, how peace can feel so heavy and light at the same time. When I arrived, my mother was sitting on the porch, a shawl around her shoulders, watching the world without hurry. She smiled when she saw me, a small, quiet smile that felt like a welcome. We didn't talk much at first. We just sat. The silence between us no longer hurt. It breathed. It had space now, space for understanding, for things that didn't need explaining. After a while, she spoke. "I keep thinking about that night, when you left without saying goodbye." Her voice was steady, not accusing, just remembering. I didn't know what to say, I replied. I thought silence was safer. She nodded slowly. It was, back then. The air between us shifted, soft, honest. We were no longer mother and daughter locked in the patterns of expectation and disappointment. We were two women, finally meeting in the middle of our humanness. She looked down at her hands, worn, fragile, beautiful in their age. You know, she said, when I was young, I thought love was something you had to control. Keep tidy, keep proper. She paused, the wind brushing her hair. But watching you, I think I was wrong. Love isn't supposed to look neat. It's supposed to feel alive. I didn't know how to answer, so I just reached out and touched her arm. Her skin was warm. That simple contact, mother and child, 2 generations of women bound by silence, felt like an entire conversation. After a long pause, she said softly, I'm sorry. 2 words. That's all. But they landed like a prayer. And for a moment, the world felt completely still. I could have said 1,000 things in response. But instead I whispered, I know. We sat there, listening to the wind move through the trees, and I realized something. Silence wasn't our enemy. It was our language. We had always used it to say what words couldn't hold. It was only when we stopped listening to it that it began to hurt. Later, as the afternoon light shifted, my child ran up the porch steps, laughing, a sound so bright it almost startled me. They ran straight to my mother, handing her a crumpled drawing from school. It's us, they said proudly. You, Mommy, and me. My mother took the paper carefully, tracing the stick figures with her trembling fingers. She smiled, really smiled. Beautiful, she whispered. And that was it. That was the sound of the silence finally speaking. Through laughter, through art, through the gentle acceptance that we all had changed. When it was time to leave, my mother hugged us both. Not a polite, brief hug, but one that lingered, unafraid. As she pulled away, she touched my cheek, the way she used to when I was small. Take care of my music box, she said softly. It sounds different in your home. I nodded, and for the first time I believed her, because it wasn't just the box that sounded different. It was me. It was her. It was us. On the drive home, the sun dipped low, washing the sky in gold and rose. My child slept in the back seat, clutching a new drawing of all 3 of us, holding hands under a tree. And I thought about the quiet ways love repairs itself, not through grand gestures, but through the small courage to stay open. When I got home, I placed the drawing on the fridge beside the old family photo, the one where my child had once been cropped out. I didn't replace the picture. I just added the new one beside it. Both stories, side by side, the hurt and the healing, the before and the after. That night, I lay in bed and listened to the soft hum of the music box from my child's room. The same melody my mother once played for me is now echoing through new walls. And for the first time in a long time, the sound didn't make me sad. It just made me grateful. Because silence had spoken, not to erase what was broken, but to remind me that even the quietest hearts can still find their way back to love. Some nights the world feels heavier than it should. It isn't grief exactly, more like a slow remembering. The kind that comes when the house has gone still, when your child is asleep, and the only sound left is the clock, counting the years you've already lived. That was the kind of night it was when I found the old box. It was tucked behind sweaters I never wore anymore, a wooden chest I hadn't opened since the move. Inside, there were old photos, letters, and a single envelope, blank, unaddressed. For a moment I didn't remember writing it, but as I unfolded the pages, my handwriting stared back, uneven, pressed hard, the kind of writing you do when your heart is trying to speak before your courage disappears. The letter was to my family. Not to accuse, not to plead, but to say what I had never been brave enough to. It began simply, "I forgive you." I remember pausing there the first time I wrote it, wondering if that was true. Back then, forgiveness felt like surrender, like letting them off the hook for what they'd done, or worse, what they refused to see. But as I read it now, years later, I understood. Forgiveness isn't a door you open for someone else. It's the window you crack open for yourself, just enough to breathe again. I kept reading. I used to believe silence was safety, that being good, being small, being agreeable would keep me loved. But love that asks you to disappear isn't love. It's fear wearing a smile. I could almost hear the voice of the woman I used to be, careful, cautious, still trying to make sense of how the people who raised her could also be the ones who broke her heart. "I think you did the best you knew how," I had written. And maybe that's the hardest part. Because when I look back, I don't see villains. I see children who grew up afraid of being different. There were tear stains on the paper, tiny circles of truth. The kind that don't erase words, only soften them. As I read, I realized this letter wasn't a message I failed to send. It was a map, a record of the day I began to find my way out of the silence that shaped me. I wrote about my child, how they laughed without apology, how they asked questions I never dared to. I wrote about how their joy made me see the world again, unfiltered, unedited. And I wrote about the ache of realizing I had once tried to teach my child the same quiet I had been taught to survive. There was a paragraph that stopped me. "I want you to know I'm not angry anymore. Anger was my armor for too long. It made me feel strong when I was breaking. But it also kept me from hearing my own softness, the part of me that still wanted to love you." Reading that line, my chest tightened. Because even now, part of me still wanted that. Not their approval, not their change, just their love, the way I had once imagined it could be. I set the letter down and looked out the window. The moon hung low over the neighborhood, quiet and patient. There was something comforting about it, the way it just existed, asking for nothing. That's what forgiveness had become for me. Not a performance, not a gift, but an act of quiet existence. A way of saying, "I'm still here, and I've stopped waiting for you to understand." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I no longer needed to send it. The words had already done their work. After that night, I started noticing small changes in the way I lived. I spoke softer, not out of fear, but out of peace. I laughed easier. I let my child see me cry sometimes. Not the broken kind of crying, but the honest kind. The kind that teaches you it's okay to feel. Sometimes, I still think about that letter. About what might have happened if I'd mailed it. If my mother had opened it on a rainy morning. If my father had read it in his quiet chair. Would they have called? Would they have understood? Maybe, maybe not. But it doesn't matter anymore. Because forgiveness isn't about changing their story. It's about reclaiming mine. That letter sits in my drawer now, beside the music box and a few childhood photos. It reminds me that healing doesn't always need to be witnessed to be real. Sometimes the most powerful goodbyes are the ones whispered only to yourself. And on the nights when the house grows still again, when old memories drift in like the tide, I don't push them away. I let them stay for a while. I listen. Then I whisper softly, "It's okay. We made it. The silence doesn't hurt anymore." It hums like the soft echo of a song that finally found its ending. It took years for my voice to return to me. Not suddenly, not with any grand declaration, but in small, steady ways. In the way I stopped apologizing for existing, in the way I learned to breathe before answering, so I could choose truth over peacekeeping. It happened quietly, the same way I lost my voice in the first place. The morning I went back to my parents' home, the sky was pale and thin, the kind of morning that carries both ending and beginning in its air. I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore. Not reconciliation, not even understanding. I only wanted to stop feeling like a stranger in the story of my own life. My hands were calm on the steering wheel as I drove, but my heart, it pulsed like something remembering its own name. The closer I got, the more everything felt familiar. The narrow road lined with jacaranda trees, the smell of wet soil, the way the old gate creaked like a voice unsure if it still belonged to me. When my mother opened the door, she smiled the way people do when they don't know what else to do. My father was already in the living room, newspaper folded neatly beside his cup. Everything was the same. The furniture, the clock that had ticked through every unspoken word we'd ever shared. And for a moment, I almost forgot why I came. But then, I looked around, at the walls that had seen generations of quiet women, at the table that had never held my child's laughter, and I remembered. We talked about nothing at first: weather, work, the way the neighborhood had changed, all the safe, shallow things people build when truth feels too heavy to touch. Then, as the silence began to stretch, my mother said the word she always said when things felt fragile: harmony. She said it gently, like an offering. "Let's just keep the harmony," she murmured, eyes down, hands trembling around her teacup. And that was when I finally spoke. Not loudly, not angrily, just honestly. "Harmony," I said, "shouldn't mean pretending someone doesn't exist." The air went still. The house that had always hummed with unspoken rules fell silent. My father's gaze lifted from the floor, steady, unreadable. My mother blinked slowly, her lips parting but no sound coming out. I kept talking, softly, because I needed them to hear me, not defend themselves. For a long time, I thought keeping peace meant keeping quiet. But peace built on silence isn't peace. It's just fear with good manners. The words didn't come from anger. They came from somewhere deeper, from the years of watching my child look at family photos that never included them. From the nights I taught bedtime stories about love that never excludes, even when the world does. From the ache of realizing I had mistaken obedience for kindness. "I'm not here to fight," I said. "I just can't keep choosing to disappear." And just like that, something broke. Not in me, but around me. The walls, the weight, the generations of unspoken sorrow, they all began to shift. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just the sound of space finally opening for truth to breathe. My mother's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. My father looked down again, as if searching the floor for something he had dropped decades ago. Maybe the courage to speak, maybe the tenderness to listen. We sat in that silence a long time. It didn't feel cruel anymore. It felt sacred. When I stood to leave, no one stopped me. But for the first time, I didn't feel like I was walking away. I felt like I was walking toward something. Toward the life I had built, the love I had chosen, the truth that finally belonged to me. Outside, the air was warm. My child was waiting in the car, humming softly to a tune on the radio. When they looked up and smiled, it was as if the world realigned. Everything that had once felt heavy suddenly felt light, not because it was gone, but because I was no longer carrying it alone. As we drove away, I looked back once, not out of regret, but gratitude. For the first time, I could see my family clearly, not as heroes, not as villains, but as people trapped inside their own silence, just as I once was, and maybe, in their own quiet way, they were learning too. Maybe the silence we left behind would someday bloom into understanding. Maybe it wouldn't. But that no longer defined me. That day, I didn't need to be heard to feel whole. I just needed to speak, and I did. The wind moved gently through the open window, warm and forgiving. My child laughed, that wild, unfiltered sound that once embarrassed my family and now healed everything they couldn't name. I reached over and squeezed their hand, feeling the pulse of something ancient and unbroken. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was fighting for a place at anyone's table. I was already home, right here, between the sound of their laughter and the rhythm of my own breathing. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes it just brings clarity, a clean, quiet space inside you where love can finally live without permission. and as the sunlight slipped across the windshield, I whispered to the wind, not for them but for me. This is who I am now, and this is enough. The house smelled like baking bread and sunlight, not the heavy, formal kind of sunlight that filtered through grand windows, but soft, golden light spilling across the wooden floor, warm and forgiving. It reminded me of mornings I'd spent with my child, laughing over spilled cereal, letting tiny hands smear flour across the counter, and letting joy exist without permission. I had invited a few people, not out of obligation, not to prove anything. Friends who had become family, neighbors who had shared quiet kindnesses, and my child, who was finally free to be entirely, unapologetically themselves. The table was modest, yet it held everything we needed: warmth, laughter, and room for imagination. An extra plate sat at the corner, not because I hoped anyone would fill it, but because I had learned the power of leaving space. Space for forgiveness, space for memory, space for love that no longer demanded approval. The smell of roasted vegetables mingled with the scent of fresh herbs, and in the kitchen, I watched as laughter carried across the room like sunlight bouncing off old wooden floors. My child's voice rang bright and unrestrained, the sound filling every corner of the home. It was a sound that had once been silenced by unspoken family rules, now allowed to echo without apology. I set the table with care, smoothing the linen and arranging the dishes. The extra plate gleamed softly in the afternoon light, a quiet testament to all that had passed and all that had yet to come. It didn't matter who came or didn't come. What mattered was that here love wasn't conditional. Here, it didn't ask who belonged or who fit the old definitions. It simply existed. As we sat down, I noticed the little things. The way my child reached for a bread roll and smiled without hesitation. The way my chosen family laughed together, unself-conscious, unmeasured. The stories they told filled the spaces left by years of silence and absence, and as I listened, I realized that this table, this simple, ordinary table, had become a sanctuary. I thought about the past, about the empty chairs, the whispered words, the times I had felt unseen. I thought about the sorrow that had once wrapped around me like a cold shawl, heavy and relentless. But now, in this quiet afternoon glow, that sorrow had softened. It hadn't vanished. It had transformed into something gentler: understanding, acceptance, and the deep, steady hum of peace. I poured tea and watched steam curl like fragile smoke, rising and vanishing in the warm air. Each movement, each laugh, each glance carried meaning. They were small, ordinary gestures, yet they held more love than all the ceremonies and appearances of the past. I realized that family wasn't built on rules or blood alone. It was built on presence, on attention, on the willingness to see each other fully, without pretense. My child reached across the table, taking my hand with trust that had never wavered, even when the world had tried to erase them. And in that touch, I felt the weight of all I had endured lighten, the years of silence, of hidden pain, of careful restraint. They no longer defined us. We were writing a new story, one that began here, in laughter and the warmth of shared meals. I lingered on the edges of the moment, savoring the quiet joy. Not loud, not boisterous, just present, breathing, alive. I watched my child tell a story, exaggerated and bright, and the room erupted with soft chuckles. For the first time, I felt fully rooted in a sense of belonging that I hadn't known was possible. The extra plate caught my eye again, gleaming quietly. It wasn't for anyone who had caused pain or whispered words behind doors. It was for memory itself, for the lessons learned in grief and silence. It was for the possibility that someday, even absent family might find a way to witness the love we had nurtured. But it was also for us, right here and now, a symbol of abundance, inclusion, and the quiet courage it takes to rebuild. As the sun dipped lower, spilling gold across the table, I felt a peace I had never thought possible. Not the fleeting kind, not the surface smile that hides worry, a deep, steady peace like the pulse of the earth beneath the floorboards. I realized that love, real love, doesn't need to be inherited or validated. It simply grows quietly, in the spaces we choose to make for it. I looked at my child, laughing freely, and whispered to the fading light, "This is the family I was meant to build. one where love never asks who belongs. And in that moment, I understood fully. The past was a shadow, but it no longer ruled the room. We were here, alive, together, whole. The table was full, not just with food, but with the quiet affirmation that love could be rewritten. No walls, no whispers, no exclusions, just presence, just belonging, just life, shared and luminous. As evening settled, the laughter softened into gentle conversation, stories lingering like warm light in the corners. I left the kitchen for a moment and glanced back at the table. The extra plate gleamed quietly, a silent witness to a journey that had been long and difficult, yet had led to something infinitely tender and human. The house no longer held fear, or expectation, or the weight of withheld words. It held possibility, presence, and peace. And as I rejoined my family, my child's hand in mine, I knew that this table, this home, would always be a place where love arrived first, without conditions, without judgment, and without silence. Here, in the golden glow of ordinary life, we had found our sanctuary, and that, I realized, was more than enough.